So I'm sitting down in Los Angeles, which is located in California. The country, as Eric would say, I don't remember with the country's name depending on how the country behaves. So we are in Los Angeles, we're in California, and I'm sitting down at Eric Owen Moss Architects. Eric is obviously the owner of Eric Owen Moss Architects. He is also the director of SciArc since 2002 and has been teaching at SciArc since 1974. So he's had more than 40 years of influence, over different schools, but 40 years of influence at SciArc. Eric needs no introduction, and I'm not going to list his achievements and awards, but I am going to attempt at channeling a Moss-style introduction. What you see is what you get. What you see is what you don't get. In case you don't see it, this is what you don't get. You don't get to listen to a silent listener's ear. And when that listener starts to speak, he may say things you can't hear. Hearing words might be the problem, because at times they're designed. They can come in the form of a shrug, or something that can't be defined. Don't try using a dictionary. These words don't exist. He is the writer of the riddles that demystifies architecture's myths. He is no mythology, believe me, he exists. A powerful prodigy you just can't resist. He is outside of the outside and inside of the in. You can't define him. Simply, you'd never win. Some call him Eric, some prefer Moss, but there's a lot to a name when you're Eric Owen Moss. So thank you, Eric, for agreeing to sit down with us this morning. And I'd like to jump in straight away and ask, what would you consider was your first architectural project? Not necessarily a built project, but what would you consider your starting point, or do you have one?
Whatever. I'm not sure those kinds of questions make a hell of a lot of difference. It's a little bit like the question of what's your best project, which is probably the next question. And the answer to what is your best project is very often, if the question is a cartoon and the response is a cartoon, what's your best project, and the answer is the next one. I think in a certain way, I think I mentioned to you when we were talking the other day, that there actually is a Polaroid photograph of the first project I did in the University of California at Berkeley, and I didn't try to find it. It's an odd agglomeration of strange pieces. It was hung up from the ceiling. It's difficult to describe because it's not a single form. It seems to be somewhere between happenstance and hodgepodge of pieces flying around. It's made out of corrugated cardboard. And I have a sense that was my first attempt in an academic venue to try to make something in a tangible way that belonged to a discussion of architecture as I understood it at the time. The other thing that I would say is I think there was probably a moment, maybe when we did the Weston House. There's a nice book on that house. Biden made a book on it, where I started to re-understand or define more clearly what I wanted to do, as opposed to utilizing aspects of work and ideas that I had heard, listened to, learned, studied with, and things like that. And there probably were people who talked to me, at least a few, that I listened to. And I think the Weston House, in that sense, probably represents an independent jump, although there are probably other jumps like that. But that sticks in my mind as being a project which is a transformative project in terms of thinking, I'll take the responsibility for this. It doesn't belong to something I've done or something I learned, but now it belongs to me. I'm the author.
That reminds me of your installation at SciArc, where you had the box hanging in the ceiling and the ribbons going around it. And that brings me to the question of how do you deal with the ground and how do you deal with context? Because if you look at the box you actually take into account the I-beams that are going across, you take account, the beams that go across SciArc, and you fit the box. So the box is cut so that it fits perfectly into the ceiling at SciArc, and the ribbons go around the walls of the gallery and come back down again. So it's a deliberate consciousness of what's surrounding the project.
Well, you don't know that necessarily. You might assume that. I mean, it seems to me Megan at one point in that conversation with Jeff and Peter Noble, I can't remember who was there, said something like, you usually do this, which is a sign of an interest in the technique and the assembly and so on. And I said, maybe not. That's what you do. That's not necessarily what I do. And almost inevitably in those discussions, particularly from people who have opinions, they're reading their opinions onto the back of work that then seems to conform to their way of doing work or analyzing work and so on and so on. I mean, in terms of things that fit and don't fit, or the idea, this is an issue for me or a problem for me, but I'm not particularly interested in the correlation of all of the parts as if you were to make a puzzle, for instance, but ultimately the puzzle would be made of pieces that are reconcilable and come together. I think I've always felt that there was something in architecture, just like there was something in my life, or lives in general, and maybe calling it something is not really the way to describe it. There was something essential and fundamental in the effort to understand and the inability to understand. And I think there's a little epigram to the big book, the construction manual, that says something like that, you know, that one makes an effort to understand and continually comes up short. So I think the work that I do, that we all do here, I think is somehow an effort to understand, absent the props or the regulations or the arguments that usually accompany architecture, that somehow we're conforming to an ideological, a priori series of preferences or beliefs, questions of how things are assembled and why they're assembled in a certain way, trying to be different, or trying to be different by not being different, and the psychology or the meaning of why you do what you do. And I think these kinds of discussions could be very long and arcane in some ways. But I think it might come down to whether the SciArc installation conforms to that or not. Essentially saying that I don't believe the world, I'm not a progressivist, that the world necessarily gets better, that architect should be a sign or a symbol that it gets better. I think it gets different. And there are probably arguments that it doesn't even get different. But if it gets different, it gains, and while it gains, it loses. I mean, if you're Marco Polo and you walk to Cathay, you probably know something that if you're sitting in Vienna and you fly to Shanghai, you don't know. A guy who takes 20 years and a guy who takes 10 hours knows something very different. And so I wouldn't want to say that the guy who is flying to Shanghai is superior to intellectually or understands something that Marco Polo, for instance, didn't understand. For sure, there is a transformation of thinking and understanding, but I think it also concedes on the way to changing. It gives up certain things. And there's not what some people call a zero sum. There's not a total. There are more and more pieces, and more pieces than you can ever fit together. So almost ipso facto, when you do something, or you decide to take a certain direction, you're leaving something out that also has some reality or some truth. And you never get to the end of that discussion. And I think a part of what interested me was to find a way that architecture could confirm, aside from all of the things that we could stipulate that architecture needs to be responsible for, that it could also contain an interrogatory or investigation of this process of changing and what change means or might mean. And how do you signify that? Meaning getting different is not necessarily getting better.
I think maybe the next question I have is maybe overused and saturated, but a lot of the discussion going on is that architecture is currently in a vulnerable state, or that architecture is at a state where the architects may not be needed anymore in the future. How do you react to that? Do you agree with it, or do you just think it's another
I don't think it's silly. I don't see why that cultures that need a voice, and in some ways architecture can be and has been the voice of the culture that rules, and architecture can also be the voice of the antithetical hypothesis that contests what the culture rules. I think I know, and I think there are friends that I have that started out as the antithetical voice and became now the advocacy. I think that transition is worth thinking about. But somewhere between those two, even when you work for, when Michelangelo was painting the back wall of the Sistine Chapel, not only painting himself as St. Bartholomew getting beaten to hell, whatever that communicates in a psychotherapeutic sense, but he put the client in hell in the Pope. The Pope is in hell, which one might consider to be antithetical to the primary cultural voice. And I think in one form or another, as long as there is a culture or a point of view, there will be advocates for that culture, whether they're political advocates or social advocates or artistic and architectural advocates, and there will be people whose vantage point suggests there's something missing in that culture, and they'll build that into the discussion of structure and architecture and cities and all of that. I don't see that changing. I don't see why it should, because whatever we have here is not static. It moves in one way or another, and one of the voices that perpetuates that movement or sustains it or disrupts it and moves it in another way is the voice of architecture. I don't see that there's any chance that that'll go away. It won't go away at all.
Before you referred to Los Angeles as a series of islands and connectors, as a description for the city, and I'm wondering where would you place architecture? Is it the mediator between connectors and islands, or is it the island or the connector?
I don't remember saying that. I don't know that I think the way I would characterize Los Angeles, and this is part of my experience, somebody will come in from somewhere, from Singapore or Vienna or Johannesburg or New York, and say, hey, we want to see something, we can't find it. One thing you can find is the power grid, the LA River, the old train tracks, and of course the freeways. They're big pieces of infrastructure that define the city, define it, and in certain ways subdivide it so that the order of the city is less a planned order in a conventional or traditional way and more a civil engineered city in terms of big pieces of infrastructure, in many cases which don't work. Sometimes the power grid, the trains were gone, the trains were here, the trains are gone, the trains are back. That's a discussable subject. The freeways, of course, and what the freeways do to the city and to the community. If you're north of the 101, you're in a different world than if you're south of the 101. If you're east of the 405, you're in a different context than if you're west of the 405. I mean, they subdivide the city in a primitive zoning way. It wasn't done very sensitively, it wasn't done very intelligently, aside from the fact that the pieces aren't operationally intelligible, in case you haven't been on a freeway recently. Maybe it works at 4 in the morning. So if that leads to a city which is piecemeal because it's been subdivided by large decisions about positioning infrastructure, then those are the pieces, and then there might be a question about how the pieces would interrelate. And we've done several projects and made several proposals on how to ameliorate the infrastructure or the subdivisions between pieces of the city. If that's what you mean, I think there is a discussion about the next city, or the city built over the city in Los Angeles, and how that would be done as a series of organizational priorities. And however it's done, I think one of the fundamental answers would be to ameliorate or modify these, what I think are culturally and sociologically arbitrary subsets or subdivisions of the city that stand as a consequence of the positioning of big pieces of infrastructure. So if you re-inhabit the infrastructure, if you redefine the infrastructure so you're on it and above it and under it, and you can make ways of integrating, let's say, perpendicular to the infrastructure, so that it doesn't be, that those pieces don't become zones of infrastructure only and are no longer subdivisions but are connectors. And there may be ways of doing that. Part of the problem is that to do that, you get into the role of authorities like the river, the LA River. You need to deal with the Corps of Engineers, with the highway system. You have various other authorities. So architecture is easier in the sense that you have an individual piece in a city with boundaries and rules and clients. And it's probably easier to make that the exception than to turn the freeway system, which is clearly a rule and a clumsy rule, into a new exception. But I think that ought to be part of the goal of redefining the city of LA. In other words, not to acquiesce, not to accept it is, as they say, what it is, whatever exactly that means, as opposed to maybe it ought to be what it isn't at the moment. And then you have to be ready to take on all those characters.
And you said in one of your introductions previously that the winner builds and the builder writes the history books. So
I don't think that sounds right either. There's a bromide cliche, or whatever you want to call it, and maybe it's not. I'm not sure that if something is a cliche, that means ipso facto it's not so. It just may be it's repeated a lot, which is the winners write the history books. That may be true in contemporary history. In other words, whoever won the Second World War was not so contemporary anymore, might be in a position to write the history. But 100 years later, or 500 years later, then the mission to understand becomes different. And it has always interested me that there is no definitive history, that one keeps rewriting history and histories. There was a discussion which is very often referenced between Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger when Nixon went to China, which I've referred to a few times, because it fascinates me in terms of the question of understanding something, because I don't think anything that matters is ever understood except briefly, and then it has to be re-understood. So I'll understand it if I think I understand it, you'll have to re-understand it differently. And Kissinger came to China, as everybody knows, with Nixon, and Mao was there, and Zhou Enlai was there. And Kissinger is supposed to have asked Owen, what do you think about the French Revolution? And Zoe and I was supposed to have answered, I don't know, not enough time has passed yet. And this was in the 1970s, so the French Revolution had been over for 170, 80, whatever it was. And this can be explained in a number of different ways. One, that we never know, but we're continuing, like we said at the beginning, to try to find out. Or another way, which is slightly different, is we think we know. We think we know what it means to do science. We think we know what it means to paint. We think we know what it means to use technology in a certain way. But we won't always think about it in that way. And another time we'll think about it in a different way. And if that's what Zoe and I meant with that, I think this is an interesting perspective to be considered. One individually has to be careful not to answer everything in such an equivocal way. When you make a project, you have to make a project. So inevitably things are ruled in and ideas are ruled out and so on and so on. And then you get to think about it later and say, okay, if we did X, we could have done Y, so next time we'll do Y. That's more a theory for how you go forward. You know, do you go forward by over time establishing a rule system? In other words, we will always do this. I think what happens to architects, including good architects, is that they start out in a more fragile way, in a more experimental way, trying to understand how to make whatever they're making. But inevitably, over a period of time, you start to see things you recognize. And then you say, okay, this comes from this architect. This is what I'm more interested in the time when it wasn't so clear what that architect would do, when it wasn't a system or a method or a tactic or a strategy, but it was an investigation. And I think what I would argue for, and I know it's not easy, and I know making a speech is different than actually delivering, is that architecture is a perpetual investigation, that you never accept any of these premises forever, that the premise itself is subject to interrogation. I think that's where the most interesting work comes. And that's why I think that for a lot of architects, the most interesting work is the early work, not when it's solidified.
So, talking about understanding and re-understanding and sometimes maybe not understanding, when you see an EOM building, it doesn't behave like a building. But how do you understand a building like per se is, and what is a building to you? Does it matter what a building is, or does it matter what a building is?
I don't know what you mean when you say what a building is. Buildings are lots of things, and they have lots of associations, lots of responsibilities, lots of meanings. And when people talk about architecture, you think, okay, this is a courthouse. It has this many courts, this many jury rooms, this many judges' chambers, so on and so on. Or it looks like a courthouse because a notion or the symbolism of law in the culture, for instance, the lady blindfolded. In Brasilia, there's a huge statue Niemeyer put up there, so there's a huge late justice blindfolded. Why? Because justice isn't supposed to prioritize anybody. So there's the symbolism of a building, the cultural associations of a building, the operation of a building, and all the things everybody always talks about. What is the site? What is the country? What is the budget? All of those things. And I think anybody who does projects has to acknowledge in a proprietary way some listing or hierarchy or interrelationship between responsibilities to all of those components. And I think what I would say is that in the when the project is done, the cultural symbolism of the building, what it means as an idea, as it addresses a series of priorities in a world where those priorities need to change, is the fundamental responsibility of the building. To keep the discussion alive, to keep the discussion current, but current wouldn't mean fashionable. It would be to understand that the building moves forward. So the obligation of the architect is to move the discussion forward. And that, the symbolization of that is critical to the meaning of the building.
Looking at all the work you've done, which there's a lot of, you've experimented with electric colors, pop themes, super graphic, the compositional, the form, the free form. You've done a lot of experimentation and you've kind of worked with everything. What is new to you now? What do you think is new? Is that...
It's a funny question. I was talking to a friend of mine about that the other day. I think one way to answer that, which sounds, I don't want this to sound like a smart aleck answer, but if you know you're already in trouble, in a certain sense, that you have to be, I've said this, and I believe this, that for me, I have to be comfortable operating in a world that I don't recognize. Comfortable, the euphemism is comfortable being uncomfortable. So if you're dealing with something you don't recognize, and you don't recognize it, and like sometimes we'll make things here, and everybody will say, geez, that's impossible, or you can't build it, or it's ugly, or it won't work, or it's preposterous, or whatever it is. And I think I've done this enough to understand that you need to be a little patient with what you don't have familiarity with. Like, what is this? What would it suggest? Does it belong to a language which is in an associational way? Here's a duct, here's a light, here's a pipe, let's say, so we all know that. Here's a column, everybody knows what that is. There's a box, we gotta understand where those originate. I'm not saying ipso facto none of that should be allowed, but I think what's new means what literally I don't recognize. And that I'm comfortable enough with trying to find a way to work with something I don't know how to work with. I think that makes people uncomfortable, or in a more generic sense, you walk into something and you don't walk into a monster you don't recognize, so you should be frightened. So to wander into something you don't recognize is frightening. So architecture, and the making of architecture, should have the capacity to frighten the person who is making it. It should frighten you. But that wouldn't necessarily chase you away, in the sense that if you could overcome that, the inability to recognize, or what should I do with this, or how can I use this? Oh, I'll retreat to something I know and I've done and I recognize. And I think that takes a certain kind of psychological resilience, particularly as time goes on and people begin to come to you who don't know you and now that do know you, and they come to you with the expectation that you will do something like, I like that one. Can you give me, here's a mock, can you give me one of these? And I think the answer, whether it's the answer that you give to the client would be a different proposition, but I think the answer you give to yourself is no, I won't do that.
If you're from SciArc There is a question by Eric that you would always see come up, which is, if building is the answer, then what is the question? And I'd like to end our discussion today by saying, Eric, if Eric Owen Moss is the answer, what is the question?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I said that, but I think if the way to rephrase that would be that if building is the answer, it's not an answer if it doesn't ask a question, which is a little bit different. In other words, to do it as a passive act or an act of confirmation of an a priori point of view, which means it wouldn't actually ask a question, nor would it be an answer to anything that hadn't already been answered. So I think what I was saying in slightly different words is that if you do it, you have a chance to be successful if it raises a topic, not necessarily in a verbal way, an intellectual way, or even in a discursive, polemical way, but it moves you, it adjusts you, it comes after you, it chases you, or it asks you to chase it in a way that might allow you to see yourself and your understanding of the context of your own life in a perspective that hadn't occurred to you before. In other words, to continue to reopen the discourse is really the job.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time.
Sure.